Thank you very much. I'm so thrilled to be here. So let me just thank Steve McKenna, who's done so much heavy lifting on the administrative side and was such a pleasure to deal with, and also Suzanne Ross for that lovely introduction, the Raven Foundation. It's been very interesting being here so far, which means that I've been writing all of this stuff on this paper that I was going to give, so I'm hoping that I'm able to read my own scrawls. I titled this paper, The Scapegoat Whisperer, on the model of the horse whisperer, meaning a trainer with a special empathy for the motives, needs, and desires of horses, drawing from insights into equine psychology. The reason is that I've spent the last couple of years in frequent conversation and correspondence with people, mostly men, but a growing number of women, who've gotten caught up in sexual accusations, usually in academic settings, but increasingly not academic settings, which I'll get to, oftentimes losing their careers, essentially their lives in the process. The majority of those who've contacted me were, I believe, innocent of anything particularly nefarious or predatory, though as I listened to their stories, I often nevertheless had questions about the judgment they displayed or failed to display, which I'll also get to. They'd been made into scapegoats, though perhaps some scapegoats are unwittingly complicit in their fates. Or if not guilty of what they're charged with, perhaps a bit guilty of something else? Or was it simply my need to think so? Among the matters I want to investigate here is the ambivalence of being on the receiving end of a scapegoat story. I'll also offer some speculations about why this particular version of scapegoating, that is, the sexual scapegoat, is so useful or necessary or demanded at the present moment in male-female relations. Is there a crisis in 21st century heterosexuality for which this new scapegoat cohort provides some sort of symbolic solution? I was about to then also launch into some quick background on how I worked myself up to this not so exalted role, but Suzanne explained a lot of it. But I'll say a bit of it briefly. Sometime in early 2015, I got an email from an editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education asking me to write an essay on campus sexual politics. I'm someone who's spent most of my career writing on sexual politics, and I suppose I have a reputation as something of a contrarian feminist. At first, I said no because I didn't think I had much to say on the subject, but the editor persisted and said they wanted a no-holds-barred essay, and she kept flattering me about how great it would be and upping the money. And because I was under the impression that no one actually read the Chronicle of Higher Education, I certainly never thought students read it. I said yes, and I wrote the asked for no-holds-barred piece with a fair amount of irony about the new campus codes banning professor-student dating and about trigger warnings, and especially about the increasing professions of vulnerability by students, women students mostly, the demand for safe spaces, and how, from my vantage as a feminist, this was all pretty terrible for feminism. And that part I meant unironically. I may have even used the term feminist paternalism. The Chronicle titled the essay, that wasn't my title, Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe. My overall point was that policies and codes that bolster traditional femininity, which has always favored stories about female endangerment over stories about female agency, are the last thing in the world that's going to reduce sexual assault, which is a goal I assume everyone shares, me included. I also compared the situation when I was a student, when sleeping with professors was pretty common, and as an example of the new climate of vulnerability, mentioned the case of a philosophy professor on my campus who'd been charged with sexual misconduct for supposedly forcing a student to drink, following which they'd slept in the same bed but didn't have sex. I pointed out that not very long ago, professors dating and indeed marrying students was more or less a social norm. In fact, you can barely throw a stone on most campuses around the country without hitting a dozen professors married to former students. Yet professors who've dated students were suddenly being treated as virtually predators, which struck me as slightly melodramatic. And in fact, male professors generally were and are increasingly being regarded as predators in waiting. The next thing I knew, students were staging a protest march against me in the essay and marching to the president's office carrying mattresses and pillows and signs accusing me of supporting rape culture. This was a reference to the mattress girl carrying the mattress around a Columbia University campus. I think they were also demanding that I be officially censured, but I never found out for sure. Then, as you heard, I was brought up on Title IX complaints by 2 graduate students for creating a hostile environment, among other things. To make a protracted story short, I went through a 72-day investigation by a team of outside lawyers hired by my university and was eventually found not guilty of anything. So just in case there are non-academics here who have no idea what Title IX is, the backstory is that in 2011, the Obama administration, Department of Education, expanded Title IX's mandate beyond gender discrimination, such as funding for women's sports, to incorporate sexual misconduct, everything from sexual harassment to coercion to rape, and also dictating that the campus adjudications use the lowest possible standard of proof, what's called preponderance of evidence, or as it's sometimes described, 50-50 plus a feather. How that feather of preponderance is arrived at in too many cases I've since learned about is via crude gender stereotypes about men as eternal predators and women as passive and desireless. And most of the time, these findings rely on complete guesswork. But back to my story. I will say that between the protest march and the Title IX complaints, I started feeling like a detective who's gotten too close to the information someone doesn't want him to have and gets thwacked on the head in a dark alley. It was like I was Sam Spade being warned off the subject, which obviously convinced me that I was onto something and to keep writing more, if only out of stubbornness. Also, I don't think you get whacked over the head when you're wrong. It happens when you're saying things people don't want you to say. So I wrote a second article titled My Title IX Inquisition. Again, that was a Chronicles title, and eventually a book, Unwanted Advances, detailing what I've learned about the shoddiness and capriciousness of the Title IX process. The effect of going public about the charges against me in the investigation was that it immediately put me on the receiving end of hundreds of emails and documents relating to other people's Title IX cases, some students, but primarily professors who felt they'd been railroaded in campus investigations and had no one else to talk to. My inbox became a clearinghouse for depressing and infuriating tales of overblown charges, secret tribunals, illogical verdicts, and frightening bureaucratic excess. A lot of what I learned was shocking, and I'm not exactly unjaded about institutional power. This story about the excesses and overreach of Title IX hadn't been widely known before I wrote about my case because it all happens behind closed doors and is shrouded in demands for confidentiality, gag orders effectively, enforced with threats about more charges if the accused go public. I suspect that I'm now the world's expert on bizarre Title IX cases brought against professors. At a certain point, I was talking to so many accused professors that every week I started feeling like the official Title IX shrink. I soon learned that when I talked to people on the phone, these conversations could go on for hours. And frankly, I started dreading these calls. Or I'd ask for more details from someone by email and receive thousands of words in response because they couldn't talk to friends or colleagues and they were bottled up with impotent rage. They'd been subject to crazy accusations, had sat through insulting, often completely unprocedural investigations, then threatened not to speak about it to anyone. So that's how my role as Scapegoat Whisperer came into being. Lately, I've been getting contacted by people caught up in Me Too investigations or accusations as well, which I'll get to. As far as the campus stories, many of them were quite astounding in ways that bear some thinking about. Let me give you a flavor of the kind of story I was hearing. This one was told to me by a tenured professor at a major public university. I'll call him Dave. I'm going to go into a bit of detail here because the details actually fascinate me, and I hope you. It's also a glimpse at how modern bureaucracies lend themselves to what would otherwise seem like an antiquated ritual, the scapegoat mechanism. A couple of years ago, Dave, who's been teaching for close to 30 years, got into an argument with the chair of the graduate program in his department, a woman, during a committee meeting over graduate funding. He thought she was trying to deprive one of his students of a nomination for a national grant in order to nominate one of her own students. Yelling commenced, and the department chair, also a woman, told them both to leave the room. While they were out of the room, the committee decided to nominate Dave's student for the grant, which she eventually received. Not to spoil the story, but note that it commences with a rivalry over resource allocation and eventually leads to symbolic, or at least professional violence and exclusion. Dave had previously complained to the department chair about this grad program chair. I believe he thought he should be in the role. And he brought the matter up at a meeting the next day in front of the entire faculty. Maybe Dave was right, or maybe Dave is something of a pain in the ass. I don't know. In any case, the chair became extremely indignant and adjourned the meeting. 2 days later, the chair went to the campus Title IX office and complained that Dave had been inappropriately hostile to female colleagues and expressed her view that what he'd done was sexual harassment. And this has become an increasingly common move, by the way. Something a man says in a meeting or a class that has nothing to do with sex is nevertheless reframed as harassment and investigated as such. The Title IX director, who happened to be a man, told the chair that nothing she described constituted sexual harassment, and unless she could bring other evidence of misconduct, his office wouldn't undertake an investigation. So, of course, she set about collecting other evidence. A few months later, Dave gets word from his academic senate office that a formal grievance had been filed against him by 5 female professors alleging that his behavior was disruptive and interfered with the conducting of departmental business and was therefore a violation of the faculty code of conduct. Also that because Dave's disruptive outbursts were directed more at female than male faculty, it constituted a form of sexual harassment. And that because he'd engaged in unwanted physical contact with some female faculty and graduate students because he'd kissed them on the cheek upon greeting at events like department holiday parties. In other words, the ante was being upped, and Dave was assigned to a new category, from departmental pain in the ass to sexual predator. After various preliminaries, a formal Senate hearing was held, which went on for 2 weeks. The Associate Vice Chancellor, a woman, presented the university's case against Dave on behalf of the complainants. The 5 faculty members, along with grad students, enlisted to testify as witnesses. The grad students didn't press any actual charges, but they did testify that Dave had occasionally kissed them on the cheek or given them hello hugs. Even if these were ostensibly non-sexual, they were still presented as evidence of something. In addition, there was testimony about Dave's custom of offering pieces of chocolate muffin to the office staff. The campus bakery happened to make really good, really large chocolate muffins, which Dave loved, but he couldn't eat a whole one. On those mid-afternoons, when he was in his office and feeling hungry, he'd go to the bakery and buy one, divide it into quarters, take 1/4 for himself, and offer the remaining 3/4 to members of the office or library staff, which included both men and women. Sometimes people turned him down, but usually not. At his hearing, a couple of his accusers claimed that offering muffins to the female staff constituted a form of inappropriate and sexually suggestive behavior. You're laughing. When asked by the committee how offering a muffin could be construed as inappropriate, his accusers claimed that a chocolate muffin is a surrogate form of fecal matter, and that Dave was, in the words of one, essentially telling the staff to eat my shit. Additionally, one accuser, a feminist theorist, I'm sorry to say, insisted that he'd offered pieces of muffin with his saliva on them, that he stood close to the women involved, looming over them as they sat at their desks, forced them to eat the pieces of muffin in front of him, and that the entire process was a form of sadistic bullying intended to assert his position as a powerful male in the department. When pressed, the accuser admitted that she herself had never personally seen him offer muffins to any members of the staff. The transcript of the hearing ran 1,200 pages. The hearing committee cleared Dave of the sexual harassment charges, but found him guilty of disruptive behavior. It recommended that he receive a letter of censure, undergo anger management training, that his salary be docked 10% for 1 year. Then it was up to the chancellor, a man, to make a final adjudication. He followed the recommendation of the Senate committee, except he docked Dave's salary for 2 years, not 1. Then Dave's dean imposed additional sanctions, even though this was unprocedural. His office would be moved out of the art history department to another building. He was suspended from teaching graduate courses or having any contact with grad students. He was only to meet with students in a designated room in the administration building, with the door open, of course. He was not to meet with any students off campus. Also, he was not to attend department meetings or events. The dean and the university lawyers said the added strictures weren't actually disciplinary actions because they weren't listed among the 4 kinds of disciplinary action described in the academic personnel manual. Dave's lawyer pointed out that public flogging wasn't listed among the 4 forms of disciplinary action either, but if Dave were to be flogged, it would obviously still be a form of punishment. Dave filed yet another grievance, and at last word is waiting to hear the outcome. At this point, the situation has been going on for over 3 years, and Dave, who hired a lawyer for the hearing, has spent over $40,000 defending himself. It used to be said, this is to be cliched about academia, that academic politics are so ugly because the stakes are so low. But the stakes have been upped. It doesn't seem hyperbolic to call this ritual murder, the murder of a reputation in any case. The charges, too, appear to occupy the realm of the symbolic. The committee expels the shit, Dave, and purifies itself. But from what? Dave suspects he may have been resented by some of his colleagues because he's more productive as a research scholar than anyone else in the department, and judging from the course evaluations and student evaluations, according to Dave himself, either the best or second best teacher. Of course, he's also a self-admitted complainer, that is, a pain in the ass, with a history of complaints about the ways things are run in his department and by the administration. He'd unwisely locked horns in the past with the preceding dean, who became a vice chancellor, as well as with his current dean, both of whom may have had their own reasons to punish and humiliate him. If Dave's version of the story has credence, perhaps the punishment ritual was a way of cutting him down to size, to equalize the community. I don't think this is far-fetched. It's well known that in academic hiring, bringing in someone too accomplished is not always viewed as desirable for what's euphemistically known as department culture. My own observation is that, generally speaking, the old academic star system is increasingly under attack, with charges of privilege leveled against those seen as either getting too many perks or showing up the less accomplished. Even seniority is lately seen as a badge of dishonor. A broader way to look at the situation is that our moment demands scapegoats, and aging white males like Dave make especially good candidates. As with the professor on my campus, who's in the philosophy department, who's the subject of the book I wrote, partly the subject, everyone knows they're all, as I said, essentially predators in waiting. I should also interject, though, as I say aging white male sort of glibly, that the racial politics of scapegoating on campus is much more complicated than it's possible to know, including when it comes to the undergrad situation, which comprised the majority of Title IX cases. Accusations arising from interracial hookups are reportedly vast, though this is anecdotal as there's no data on race collected, or on Title IX cases generally, it should be said, which makes writing on the subject challenging. Still, the point is that sexual harassment or assault charges can now mean virtually anything, and even if you're found not guilty, you can be punished anyway, exiled from colleagues and department, for students expelled, or in an interesting term that's used on my own campus, excluded for a period of years during which one's transcript is often frozen. Let me quickly add that I'm the first to admit that there are sexually sleazy professors and foul-acting undergrads. Anyone who harasses, who gropes, who proposes quid pro quos should be fired, in my view. But then I opened yet another email from a professor who, let's say, dated an ex-student a number of years ago. That student decides years later to lodge a complaint, or her mother complains to the dean, even at a school where there are no codes against professors dating ex-students. And the professor is forced to resign, or in the case of a non-tenure track position, simply not renewed, even when found innocent of any wrongdoing. Or anonymous accusations are made, which are demonstrably false, yet an open-ended investigation is launched with investigators interviewing your students and your colleagues, even people you've never met, to dig up whatever rumors and dirt are available. Remarks you supposedly made in class, though garbled and out of context, are presented to you by investigators. I've heard this, numerous times. Explanations are demanded. You're asked to explain why you taught a poem with sexual content in a creative writing class. The investigators don't seem to have heard of academic freedom. The fact is that at the moment, any hint of sexuality is cause for charge bringing. I've heard from professors accused of such crimes as suspicious eye contact, or complimenting someone on looking nice today, or liking someone's Facebook post, or inviting a grad student to discuss her work over coffee sometime. I heard from a professor who, while visiting another campus, reached into his pocket to pull out a business card to hand to the grad student he was talking to, but accidentally pulled out his hotel room key card and was accused of hinting to the student that if she slept with him, he would promote her professionally. This professor lost his job and is currently appealing. If sexuality as such is grounds for accusation and investigation, then pretty much anyone can be investigated for something, as sexuality is notoriously leaky. When I first started writing about campus paranoia, I thought that the accusatory mania was spillover from the undergraduate sexual assault problem, that there had been a failure to deal honestly with the realities of drunken student sex, which is both rampant and not always particularly pleasant, particularly for the women, with blurry lines between consent and non-consent, which had led to such a vast widening of the prosecutorial and bureaucratic nets and such an increase in regulation making that people like myself and Dave were getting caught up in the sweeps. But as I listened to these mounting stories of accusation, I also found myself, I confess this guiltily to this audience, I also found myself trying to form connections between these myriad scapegoats, to uncover a structure, a common thread. Part of me wanted to blame them for getting caught up in these absurd ordeals, to find some propensity, some tell, something they should have done differently. Many, I came to think, had boundary issues. They forgot to keep sufficient professional distance with students. Even when there was no actual sex, something ineffable had perhaps been violated. Maybe they didn't understand how they came off. Maybe they were a little spectrum-y, or were bad at reading social cues, as academics often are. I don't want to say male academics particularly, I can't really say. Others were simply oblivious to the changing climate and the increasing stigma around intergenerational sex. The professor I wrote about in Unwanted Advances had unwisely gone out drinking with an undergrad. This was in early 2012, at which point dating between professors and students was actually still permitted on our campus, yet the warning signs were there. He'd been oblivious to these signs, somehow thinking that formal permission was permission enough. He'd failed to be sufficiently paranoid, let's say, which is arguably a form of entitlement, to use the current vernacular. Maybe he deserved his fate, or so part of me was maybe just a little convinced. As Me Too emerged in late 2017, I began to think about this situation more broadly. I kept getting asked about the relation between Title IX and Me Too. Despite everything I knew about overblown sexual accusations on campus, I was an early enthusiast on Me Too. From a political standpoint, these exposés about the extent of egregious sexual harassment and incursion looked like a significant cultural upheaval, a major victory in the centuries-long fight for women's equality. What was being revealed, I wrote, shortly after the Harvey Weinstein story broke, which had been followed, if you recall, by a veritable parade of other accused high-profile men, what was the extent to which sexual exploitation and access to women's bodies had been treated as a resource to be extracted, to expropriate by those in a position to do so. It turned out that in the tallest skyscrapers and plushest hotels of the most advanced economies, men in positions of workplace power had been acting the part of feudal lords, demanding droit de seigneur from their vassals, in this case their female employees, and others wishing entree to their fiefdoms. There had been, in effect, a covert system of taxation on female advancement in the work world, with the unluckier among us obligated to render not just the usual fealty demanded by overweening bosses, but varying degrees of sexual homage, too, from ego stroking and fluffing, which is gross enough, to being grabbed and groped, to, as with Weinstein, the expectation of silence about full-on rape. If the basic premise of liberal democracy is to own one's own person, clearly women had not yet advanced to full citizenship. Harvey Weinstein was and continues to be a wonderfully convenient monster. The world could unite around his monstrousness and see his takedown as justice served, men and women alike. He could solve the problem. To begin with, he looked and acted the part. Fat, gross, infantile, rageful, rapacious, and amoral, and it appears a serial rapist. When he wasn't physically forcing women into sex, he was coercing women into sex. He offered monstrously laughable excuses about having grown up in different times. Monstrously, he tried to align himself with the spirit of '68. He was just one man, but the crimes of which he'd been accused spanned decades. His accusers now number around 90. As sexual monsters go, he was a pretty energetic one. That said, I suspect that when and if criminal charges against him go to trial, we'll be confronted with some uncomfortable ambiguities between consent and non-consent. His defense will be that women agreed to sex in exchange for anticipated career boosts, and this was their choice, however much we may object to the terms of the bargain. One of the uncomfortable things masked by Weinstein's monstrosity is the question of what is or isn't and isn't a choice in the context of heterosexual relations. On the one hand, male social power. On the other hand, the commodified female sexiness that the movie industry is built on and that propels some women to power and fame. But it turned out that Weinstein's expose and expulsion weren't actually sufficient to restore gendered peace. If anything, it widened the rift, triggering the necessity and appetite for more takedowns. But neither were the succession of exposed demi-monsters that followed sufficient. The parade of powerful men whose bad behavior in the sexual realm might have gone unremarked on 20 years ago, but were now deemed shocking and career-ending. Which is not to say that each tale that came tumbling out wasn't more sordid than the last. Infinite variations on the theme of sexual scumminess. Yet, such behaviors had never been exactly secret. But the frame had shifted. The handsy boss, the lewd entreaties, the casting couch were no longer going to be business as usual. Yet, the appetite for takedown still wasn't quelled, signified by the hashtag #TimesUp. Next came a wave of revelations about not-so-powerful men. In my world, there was the shitty media men list, comprised not of big bosses, but editors, book critics, even freelance writers, numbering around 70 men who came under attack for various infractions in a spreadsheet of anonymous accusations posted online. One book editor, someone I used to occasionally lunch with, was accused of weird lunch dates. Someone else of sending creepy text messages when drunk. The enumerated crimes were varied and infinite. A number of the accused men lost their jobs, those who had actual jobs, in the wake of formal investigations. Some for outright harassment, others for sleeping with people lower down on the pecking order, others for creating what were referred to as hostile environments. Others, without jobs at the sort of places with HR departments, were informally blackballed or worried they would be. Obviously, it's impossible to know why you're turned down for an assignment if you're a freelancer. I was contacted by a freelance writer who'd been anonymously accused on the shitty media men list he was accused of being sexually coercive and possibly even a rapist. He said he'd never raped anyone. In fact, he confessed, this was more than I wanted to know, that he didn't actually like sexual intercourse. He was into other things, but there was no way to clear his name. He tried writing a piece about what it's like being subject to anonymous and not disprovable accusations, but no one would publish it. Or they'd say they would publish it, then it would mysteriously get killed. He solicited my feedback. The piece was painfully terrible. It may be that there's no artful way to write the story of wrongful accusation. Or it may be, I found myself guiltily thinking, ungenerously, that the sexual blurriness that characterized his interactions with women defeated narrative clarity. In fact, I've been sent other such manuscripts by accused professors, which were also quite terrible, with the exception of this chocolate muffin story. I suspect the only reason I was able to pull it off in my Title IX piece in the Chronicle was that I had the luxury of not taking the accusations seriously. I could adopt a comic tone. These people were saturated in grievance, which is not a compelling literary mode. Of course, in the wake of such accusations, even ones made anonymously, the accused person is expected to simply disappear, and most have complied, though online sites are lately full of reported sightings of those who haven't sufficiently disappeared. Charlie Rose was spotted at a Midtown restaurant, shockingly. The accused writer Tao Lin, who was the subject of an online expose by an aggrieved ex, this was previous to Me Too, but it was a sort of scandal that rocked the alt-lit world, has actually dared to write another book. A recent article in BuzzFeed was titled, quote, "What are we to make of Tao Lin's comeback?" More recently, Junot Diaz retracted his previous apologia after being accused of forcibly kissing a younger writer, and none of his employers, which include MIT and the Boston Review, saw fit to fire him over the charges, leading to much consternation in the world of online feminism. Some have speculated it marks a turning point. We'll see. To be sure, many commentators have been concerned about collapsing degrees of culpability together, groping into rape, Al Franken into Harvey Weinstein. Not everyone sees it that way. From the standpoint of accusers, I surmise, the culprits aren't just individually culpable, they're also collectively culpable. So the specifics, collectively culpable and empowered by the systematic exploitation of women. So the specifics or precise degree of guilt or innocence isn't the point. These are systematic issues, not one guy's fault. There's a collective culpability for sexualizing workplaces, creating an inhospitable climate for female advancement, for implicit and explicit sexual coercion, favoritism toward women underlings who played along, and more and worse. Just to be clear, I mean, that was me sort of talking in the voice of the accusers. Just to be clear, I'm not necessarily disputing that any of this is true, or isn't true, I think is what I mean to say. Even I, who thought I was unshockable, have been stunned at the blatant sexual sleaziness and outright criminality that have been par for the course. It's an interesting situation to try to conceptualize. There are clearly valid reasons for sexual suspicion, perhaps even sexual paranoia, and at the same time, a vast scapegoat production line. Of course, the grounds for sexual suspicion have been true for a long time. What, at this point in the very long history of sexual violation and gender discrimination, brings these issues to a boiling point now? One answer is Trump, of course. The body of any leader has a way of crystallizing and magnifying social contradictions, arguably. Arguably, that's why they're chosen as leaders. I suspect, though it seems counterintuitive, that the vast gains in gender equality are themselves a crisis precipitator. The more gender progress we get, the more rancor and dissatisfaction reigns between men and women. It feels like there's a growing polarization, almost like red and blue states. Of course, the fact that gender polarization is most acute in blue states contributes to the increasing political divide in the electorate. Red states hate the gender politics of the blue states, and vice versa. One suspects that for about half the electorate, Trump's pussy grabbing was a selling point, not a hindrance. And there's, by the way, in the New York Times today, Tom Edsall has a really fantastic piece about this growing gender divide in the electorate, and I think makes some really good points about it. But why should gender progress produce more disharmony rather than less? Girard's insights on mimetic desire leading to de-differentiation are probably useful. As men and women have become more socially equal and perhaps in certain ways more similar, desiring the same things, from CEOships to sexual independence, whether or not those things are actually worth desiring, New schisms have opened. Rancor and accusations have skyrocketed. A Girardian would probably describe contemporary gender relations in terms of rivalry. Consequently, especially in the sphere of heterosexuality, interpersonal chaos reigns. I tend to think that women don't particularly know what they want from men on the whole at the moment. We desire what men have in terms of political and economic power. Some even still desire men sexually. These desires do not always harmonize successfully. The conservative retort to the decreasing differentiation between the genders has been to dig in and maintain that deep down, whether based on genetic coding or some divine plan, there are essential, intractable differences between men and women. A David Brooks column, I was talking to somebody here about hate reading David Brooks. David Brooks' column last week titled "The Gender War is On and Fake" asserts, hopefully, that even in Nordic countries where gender equality is highest, unexpected differences have opened between men and women. What he says some call the Nordic paradox, meaning that when given a choice, women choose to drop out of the workforce. The Rasputin-like Jordan Peterson has recently, you're supposed to laugh at that, recently become a big thing with similar claims borrowed from evolutionary psychology about intractable differences between men and women, a message which is supposed to somehow put us all back on track. A more radical way of looking at the current climate of accusation I started speculating about in the course of writing this paper, the gleeful bringing down of men's careers might be as an implicit demand for reparations. I'm thinking of the case that Ta-Nehisi Coates made in his impressive 2014 Atlantic magazine article on behalf of reparations for African Americans to compensate for the systematic economic exploitation of the last 3 or so centuries, the system that some have called racial capitalism. In the case of gender, what's been extracted from women has also been something of value and consequence, our sexual compliance and services. Women's sexuality has been treated as a resource to be extracted, whether that means an NPR honcho sticking his tongue into his female employees' mouths as if mining for gold, or what on campus has come to be known as rape culture in the form of undergrad men extracting sex from drunken, comatose women. The demand for reparations, a less elegant term might be payback, and I don't think this is necessarily a conscious demand, by the way, helps understand why the veracity of the charges filed against any one individual isn't entirely important. The individual culprits are symptoms of something larger, and the extent of the larger problem dictates that individuals can be sacrificed to bring about the necessary social change. Just as there's collective guilt, there should be collective contributions to the reparation fund in the form of male bodies on the line or men occupying a comparably vulnerable position to the ones women are accustomed to inhabiting. I think this is the wish, anyway, unconsciously. And such reparations can't come fast enough. These fallen careers are just a drop in the bucket in relation to the perceived injustices. This is me reading the tenor of the times. Not just a scapegoat whisperer, a Twitter whisperer. Indeed, it transpires that one monster was hardly sufficient. Our current problem is that no matter how many culprits, the guilty, the perhaps not so guilty, are brought down, the crisis persists. It gapes. The community is running out of monsters, running out of demi-monsters too. The solution? Expand the criteria for transgression, lower the bar, allowing more culprits to be caught and expelled, which is roughly where we are now. On campus, having drunken sex if you're a male undergrad, off campus simply being a jerk on the job, which means pretty much every guy on, every guy on campus and every guy in the workplace is a potential criminal. And note that in campus adjudications, in sexual situations where both students are drinking, the one that gets to the Title IX office first is cleansed of any culpability. And that person is, in heterosexual situations, invariably the woman. And as I mentioned before, the preponderance of evidence standard means, as I say in the book, basically an accusation itself suffices as preponderance to push the bar over that 50.01%. It may turn out that the cleansing power of the accusation serves useful purposes when it comes to reorganizing and redistributing power between the genders. What's also interesting is the extent to which typically conservative social institutions like universities and corporations have jumped on the bandwagon, stepping into the adjudication business for what I cynically suspect are reasons of their own. On campus, administrators now far outstrip professors in numbers and power. There's been a vast transfer of power from the faculty to the administration. In the workplace, employers are also now licensed to surveil their employees' social and sexual lives, which they've been happily doing. But weaponized grievances can be deployed by pretty much anyone who knows how to game the system. So can payback. A case in point. Recently, Susanna Walters, a sociology professor and director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality program at Northeastern, and a longtime editor of the feminist journal Signs, published an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" which argued against feminists qualifying their anger at patriarchy with phrases like, "Of course I don't hate men." Rather, says Walters, "we have every right to hate you. You have done us wrong." In response, a male professor at the University of Michigan Flint, that is halfway across the country, submitted a Title IX complaint to Northeastern, accusing Walters of violating the school's own discrimination policies, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender. Says his complaint, "She has not only publicly demonized and belittled all males at Northeastern University, she called publicly for the universal hatred of men, including all men at your university. That makes Ms. Walters a confirmed sexist and bigot in violation of Title IX." Where will the cycle of accusations end? I hope you Girardians have some answers, because I myself don't know. All I know is that these are exciting times for someone who writes about gender antagonism. Thank you.